Sergeant Alexis Rodriguez sat in the sterile review room at Camp Pendleton, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice as Captain Sarah Mitchell delivered the devastating verdict. Your emotional responses are too volatile for frontline combat. You're a liability to your unit. But what they didn't know was that this same emotional instability would soon become the very trait that would save 15 Marines trapped behind enemy lines in the mountains of Afghanistan, making Alex one of the most decorated soldiers of her generation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Alex's dream of serving in combat had been forged in the desert heat of Phoenix, Arizona, where she grew up listening to her mother's stories from the Gulf War. Sergeant Major Carmen Rodriguez had been one of the first women to serve in a combat support role during Operation Desert Storm. And every evening after dinner, she would sit on their small apartment balcony, still wearing her desert camouflage uniform, and tell Alex about the bonds forged under fire and the responsibility that came with protecting your fellow soldiers. Mia, her mother would say, using the Spanish endearment that always made Alex feel safe. Being a soldier isn't about being the toughest or the strongest. It's about caring so deeply for the people next to you that you'd do anything to bring them home. Carmen's voice would grow soft as she spoke about the friends she'd lost, the missions that haunted her dreams, and the overwhelming sense of purpose that came from serving something bigger than yourself. Alex absorbed every word. While other 8-year-olds played with dolls or video games, she would sit cross-legged on the concrete floor, completely mesmerized by tales of convoy operations, medical evacuations, and the split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. Her mother never sugarcoated the reality of war, but she also never failed to emphasize the honor that came with serving your country and protecting your fellow Americans. The Rodriguez family had immigrated from Mexico when Carmen was just 16, and military service had been her path to citizenship, education, and a better life for her future children. She instilled in Alex a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunities America had provided, along with an unwavering belief that service was the highest form of giving back. This country gave us everything, Carmen would remind Alex during their nightly conversations. Someday, when you're ready, you'll give something back. Alex's bedroom walls were covered with military memorabilia, her mother's medals, photographs from various deployments, and recruitment posters featuring strong women in uniform. She would fall asleep each night imagining herself in combat gear, leading missions through hostile territory, making the kind of split-second decisions that saved lives. The dream was so vivid, so consuming, that it shaped every decision she made throughout her childhood and teenage years. In high school, Alex threw herself into preparation with the same intensity her mother had shown during her military career. She joined the ROTC program, where she excelled in leadership exercises and tactical planning. Her instructors consistently praised her ability to think under pressure and her natural instinct for keeping her team safe during training exercises. She maintained a 4.0 GPA, while also participating in cross-country running, which built the endurance she knew would be crucial for military service. But it was Alex's emotional intelligence that truly set her apart, though she didn't realize it at the time. During group projects, she was always the one who noticed when a teammate was struggling, who could diffuse tension between conflicting personalities, and who instinctively knew how to motivate people through difficult challenges. Her friends called her the team mom because she was constantly checking on everyone's well-being, remembering important dates, and creating an atmosphere where people felt safe to be vulnerable. Alex's ROTC instructor, Colonel Davis, recognized something special in her approach to leadership. Unlike many of her male counterparts who led through authority and intimidation, Alex led through empathy and genuine care for her team members. She would spend extra time helping struggling cadets, would notice when someone was having personal problems that affected their performance, and had an uncanny ability to boost morale during the most challenging training exercises. "Rodriguez has something you can't teach," Colonel Davis would tell his colleagues. "She has the ability to make every person on her team feel valued and protected. That's the kind of leader people will follow into hell." Her performance evaluations consistently noted her exceptional interpersonal skills, her ability to maintain team cohesion under stress, and her natural instinct for keeping people safe. During her senior year, Alex received a full ROTC scholarship to Arizona State University, where she majored in communications while continuing her military training. She excelled in courses on crisis communication, conflict resolution, and psychological operations. Her professors noted her exceptional ability to read people, to understand motivations and fears, and to communicate effectively under pressure. Carmen watched her daughter's progress with immense pride, but also with a growing concern that she kept to herself. She had seen how the military was changing, how the demands of modern warfare required different skills than those she had needed during the Gulf War. She worried that Alex's compassionate nature, the very trait that made her such an effective leader, might be seen as weakness by military evaluators, who were still operating under outdated notions of what made a good soldier. "Remember, Mia," Carmen would tell Alex during their phone conversations, "your heart is your strength, not your weakness. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." But even as she spoke these words, Carmen feared that the military establishment might not be ready for a leader like her daughter, someone who led with empathy rather than aggression, who saw emotional intelligence as a tactical advantage rather than a liability. As Alex's graduation approached, and her active duty assignment drew near, she felt confident that she had prepared herself for everything the military could throw at her. She had excelled in every academic and physical challenge, had demonstrated exceptional leadership capabilities, and had received glowing recommendations from every instructor she had worked with. She was ready to serve her country in combat, to follow in her mother's footsteps, and to prove that the next generation of soldiers could be both compassionate and effective. What Alex didn't know was that her greatest strength would soon be labeled as her greatest weakness, and that the very qualities that made her such an exceptional leader would nearly end her military career before it truly began. But sometimes, the traits that make you different are exactly what the world needs most, even when no one realizes it yet. Alex's final year at Arizona State University was a masterclass in dedication and excellence. While her classmates spent weekends at parties or relaxing by the pool, Alex could be found at 0500 hours leading PT sessions for younger ROTC cadets, her voice cutting through the desert dawn as she motivated her team through grueling obstacle courses. She had transformed herself into a lean, powerful athlete, capable of carrying a full combat load for miles without showing fatigue. But it was her mental preparation that truly set her apart from her peers. Her academic performance was flawless, graduating summa cum laude with a degree in strategic communications and a minor in psychology. But Alex didn't just memorize textbooks. She devoured every piece of literature she could find about modern warfare, combat psychology, and crisis leadership. She spent countless hours in the library studying case studies of successful military operations, analyzing what separated effective leaders from those who cracked under pressure. Her professors were amazed by her ability to synthesize complex information and apply theoretical concepts to real-world scenarios. Professor Elizabeth Warren, who taught her advanced crisis communication course, would later write in Alex's recommendation letter, "In 20 years of teaching, I have never encountered a student who possesses such a unique combination of analytical intelligence and emotional awareness. Rodriguez doesn't just understand tactics. She understands people. She has an intuitive grasp of how fear, stress, and uncertainty affect decision-making in high-pressure situations. Alex's fellow cadets began to seek her out whenever they faced personal or academic challenges. She became known as someone who could help you work through problems, who could see solutions that others missed, and who never made you feel judged or weak for struggling. When Cadet Thompson was dealing with his father's cancer diagnosis and his performance began to slip, Alex spent hours helping him balance his emotional stress with his military responsibilities. When Cadet Martinez was struggling with the physical demands of training due to a previous injury, Alex developed a modified workout routine that helped him build strength without exacerbating his condition. Rodriguez has this incredible ability to see what people need before they even know they need it, observed Major Patricia Collins, the ROTC battalion commander. She can walk into a room and immediately assess the emotional state of her team. More importantly, she knows how to channel that emotional information into tactical advantages. When morale is low, she knows exactly how to motivate people. When tensions are high, she can diffuse situations before they escalate. But Alex's most impressive demonstration of leadership came during the annual field training exercise, a week-long simulation designed to test cadets' ability to operate under realistic combat conditions. The scenario involved a hostage rescue mission in a mock Middle Eastern village, complete with role-playing civilians, simulated enemy combatants, and live ammunition exercises. Most cadets focused on the tactical aspects, movement, communication, and weapon handling. Alex, however, spent equal time preparing for the human elements of the mission. She studied the psychological profiles of hostage situations, researched cultural sensitivity protocols for operating in civilian areas, and developed communication strategies for de-escalating tense encounters with non-combatants. While other team leaders planned their approaches around firepower and speed, Alex built her strategy around minimizing civilian casualties and maintaining the trust of local populations. The exercise began at 0300 hours on a moonless night. Alex's team was tasked with infiltrating the mock village, locating 3 hostages, and extracting them without alerting the entire enemy force. Within the first hour, 2 other cadet teams had been killed when their aggressive approaches triggered ambushes. Alex's team moved differently, slowly, carefully, with constant attention to their surroundings and the civilians they encountered. When they reached the building where the hostages were being held, Alex made a decision that surprised her instructors. Instead of immediately launching an assault, she sent team members to establish rapport with civilians in adjacent buildings, gathering intelligence about enemy movements and ensuring that non-combatants would be protected during the operation. The role-playing civilians, many of whom were veterans hired to make the exercise realistic, were amazed by the cadets' respectful and professional behavior. "Most teams treat us like obstacles to overcome," one civilian role-player told the exercise evaluators. "Rodriguez's team treated us like people whose safety mattered. That made us want to help them succeed." The hostage rescue itself was executed flawlessly. Alex's team neutralized the guards without alerting the broader enemy force, secured the hostages, and executed a clean extraction. But what impressed the evaluators most was Alex's post-mission debrief with the role-playing hostages, where she demonstrated remarkable skill in managing trauma responses and gathering crucial intelligence about enemy operations, preparing, and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Colonel Robert Sterling, who had flown in from Camp Pendleton to observe the exercise, was initially skeptical of Alex's approach. "Too much time spent on feelings, not enough focus on mission completion," he noted in his preliminary observations. But as the week progressed and Alex's team consistently outperformed their peers while maintaining 0 civilian casualties and perfect mission completion rates, his assessment began to shift. The final exercise was the most challenging, a simulated combat patrol in hostile territory where teams would face multiple ambushes, equipment failures, and casualty scenarios. Alex's team was moving through a narrow canyon when they triggered an IED simulation. 2 team members were designated as wounded, communication equipment was declared inoperable, and enemy forces began closing in from multiple directions, while other teams in similar scenarios had either abandoned their wounded or become paralyzed by the complexity of the situation. Alex's response was immediate and comprehensive. She established a defensive perimeter, organized medical care for the wounded, and began implementing an extraction plan that prioritized saving every team member. But most impressively, she maintained constant communication with her team, keeping everyone focused and motivated despite the overwhelming pressure. "I need everyone to stay calm and think clearly," Alex told her team as simulated gunfire echoed around them. "Martinez, you're my eyes on the north approach. Thompson, keep pressure on Johnson's wound and talk to him. I need him conscious and alert. Williams, you're with me. We're going to find an alternate extraction route that gets everyone home safely." Her ability to remain emotionally stable while managing multiple crises simultaneously was extraordinary. She gave clear, specific instructions, while also providing the emotional support her team needed to function under extreme stress. When one cadet began to panic, Alex took 30 seconds to help him control his breathing and regain focus, a decision that ultimately saved the mission when his steady aim eliminated a key enemy position. The extraction was successful, with all team members safely recovered and minimal simulated casualties among both military personnel and civilians. The exercise evaluators noted that Alex's team had demonstrated the highest levels of unit cohesion, mission effectiveness, and adherence to rules of engagement they had ever observed in a training scenario. "Rodriguez doesn't just lead soldiers," observed Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, who had been brought in as an independent evaluator. "She transforms groups of individuals into cohesive teams that will risk everything for each other. That's not a skill you can teach in a classroom. That's something that comes from understanding people at the deepest level." Alex's performance during the field training exercise earned her the highest evaluation scores in her ROTC class and a recommendation for immediate assignment to an elite unit upon graduation. Her instructors were unanimous in their assessment. She represented the future of military leadership, someone who could excel in the complex, culturally sensitive missions that defined modern warfare. But as Alex prepared for her final evaluation, before active duty assignment, she had no way of knowing that the very qualities that made her such an exceptional leader, her emotional intelligence, her empathy, her ability to connect with people under stress, would soon be twisted into evidence of her unfitness for combat. Service. The military establishment was about to confront a leader who didn't fit their traditional mold, and the collision would nearly destroy her career before it began. The evaluation facility at Camp Pendleton was a sterile, windowless building that seemed designed to strip away personality and reduce human beings to numbers on assessment forms. Alex arrived at 0600 hours on a gray March morning, her dress uniform perfectly pressed, her confidence built on 4 years of exceptional performance and glowing recommendations from every instructor she had ever worked with. She had no reason to believe this would be anything other than a formality before receiving her combat assignment. The evaluation board consisted of 5 officers, each representing different aspects of military assessment: psychological fitness, physical capabilities, leadership potential, tactical knowledge, and overall readiness for combat operations. Captain Sarah Mitchell, a stern woman with 20 years of infantry experience, served as the board's chairwoman. Colonel Robert Sterling, the same officer who had observed Alex's field training exercise, sat at the far end of the table with a thick folder that Alex assumed contained her stellar performance records. The first 3 hours of evaluation went exactly as Alex had expected. She excelled in the written tactical assessment, scoring in the 98th percentile on scenarios involving urban warfare, hostage rescue, and multi-unit coordination. Her physical fitness test was flawless. She completed the obstacle course in record time, exceeded requirements in every strength category, and demonstrated weapon proficiency that impressed even the most skeptical evaluators. Outstanding performance across all measurable categories, noted Major David Park, the physical assessment officer. Rodriguez demonstrates superior tactical knowledge, exceptional physical capabilities, and leadership scores that place her in the top 1% of candidates we've evaluated this year. Alex felt a surge of pride as she listened to the positive assessments. Everything was proceeding exactly as she had hoped. Her years of preparation were paying off, and she was moments away from receiving the combat assignment she had dreamed of since childhood. But then Captain Mitchell opened a different folder, one that contained psychological evaluation reports and behavioral assessments from Alex's time in ROTC. Ms. Rodriguez, Captain Mitchell began, her voice taking on a colder tone, while your technical and physical qualifications are undeniably impressive, this board has significant concerns about your psychological fitness for combat operations. Our review of your behavioral patterns reveals troubling tendencies that could compromise mission effectiveness and unit safety. Alex felt her stomach drop. Psychological fitness had never been questioned during her ROTC training. If anything, her emotional stability had been consistently praised by instructors and peers alike. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Alex replied carefully, "but I'm not sure I understand what specific concerns you're referring to." Captain Mitchell consulted her notes with deliberate precision. During your field training exercises, you consistently prioritized emotional management over tactical efficiency. You spent valuable time comforting distressed team members instead of maintaining focus on mission objectives. You demonstrated excessive concern for civilian casualties, even in simulated scenarios, where such concerns were tactically irrelevant. You showed reluctance to make hard decisions that might cause emotional distress to your subordinates, added Colonel Sterling, reading from his own assessment. In combat situations, leaders must be prepared to sacrifice individual concerns for our mission success. Your tendency to personalize tactical decisions suggests an emotional volatility that could prove disastrous under real combat conditions. Alex felt as though the room was tilting around her. The very behaviors that had earned her praise from instructors, her ability to maintain team morale, her skill at managing stress, her commitment to protecting both soldiers and civilians, were being reframed as evidence of psychological weakness. "Sir, respectfully, I believe those behaviors demonstrate effective leadership, not emotional instability. My teams consistently achieved mission success while maintaining unit cohesion and minimizing casualties. Mission success achieved through emotional manipulation rather than tactical superiority," Captain Mitchell responded sharply. "You rely too heavily on personal relationships and emotional appeals to motivate your subordinates. Real combat requires leaders who can make objective decisions based on tactical necessity, not emotional considerations." Dr. Helen Foster, the board's psychological assessment specialist, leaned forward with a clipboard full of behavioral analyses. "Ms. Rodriguez, our evaluation indicates that you exhibit what we classify as hyperempathic response patterns. You demonstrate excessive emotional investment in the well-being of others, which creates vulnerability to decision paralysis in high-stress situations. Combat leaders must be capable of emotional detachment when mission requirements demand it. Your psychological profile suggests that you would struggle to order subordinates into situations where casualties are inevitable," Dr. Foster continued. "You show signs of what we term emotional over-identification with team members, which could compromise your ability to make necessary sacrifices for tactical advantage." Alex struggled to process what she was hearing. Her ability to care deeply about her soldiers, to understand their fears and motivations, to maintain their trust under extreme pressure, these weren't weaknesses in her mind, they were the foundation of effective leadership. But the evaluation board was systematically dismantling everything she believed about herself as a leader. Furthermore, Captain Mitchell added, consulting another report, video analysis of your training exercises reveals excessive displays of emotion during stressful situations. You were observed providing comfort to distressed team members, showing visible concern for injured personnel, and demonstrating what our analysts describe as inappropriate emotional engagement with mission outcomes. Colonel Sterling nodded grimly. Combat effectiveness requires emotional discipline, Rodriguez. The ability to compartmentalize feelings and focus solely on tactical objectives. Your pattern of behavior suggests you lack the psychological hardness necessary for frontline operations. Alex felt her chest tightening, but she forced herself to remain calm and professional. Colonel Sterling, with respect, I believe you may be misinterpreting emotional intelligence as emotional weakness. My ability to understand and manage the psychological state of my team has consistently resulted in superior mission performance. That's exactly the problem, Captain Mitchell interrupted. You see emotion as a tactical tool rather than a liability to be controlled. Combat situations don't allow for the luxury of emotional considerations. Split-second decisions must be based on objective tactical analysis, not concern for feelings or relationships. The board spent another hour dissecting Alex's behavioral patterns, analyzing every instance where she had shown empathy, compassion, or emotional awareness as evidence of her unsuitability for combat operations. They cited her tendency to remember personal details about team members, her practice of checking on subordinates' emotional state, and her skill at maintaining morale during difficult training exercises as proof that she was too emotionally invested to function effectively under combat stress. The modern battlefield requires leaders who can maintain emotional distance from their subordinates, Dr. Foster explained. Your psychological profile indicates that you form emotional attachments that could compromise your judgment in life or death situations. You're simply too empathetic for combat operations. When the evaluation concluded, Captain Mitchell delivered the verdict with clinical detachment. Ms. Rodriguez, while you demonstrate exceptional technical competence and physical capabilities, this board finds you psychologically unsuitable for combat assignment. Your emotional responses are too volatile, your decision-making too influenced by personal relationships, and your overall psychological profile too unstable for frontline operations. You will be assigned to a support role where your technical skills can be utilized without the psychological demands of combat leadership, Colonel Sterling added. Field radio operations seems appropriate. You'll provide essential communication support while remaining safely behind front lines. Alex sat in stunned silence as the board members gathered their papers and prepared to dismiss her. 4 years of perfect performance, countless hours of preparation, and a lifetime of dreams had been destroyed in a single morning. The same emotional intelligence that had made her such an effective leader was now being used as evidence that she was unfit to serve in the role she had always envisioned for herself. As she walked out of the evaluation facility, Alex felt the weight of a devastating realization. In a military culture that valued emotional toughness over emotional intelligence, her greatest strengths had been redefined as her most dangerous weaknesses. But sometimes, the very traits that make you different are exactly what the world desperately needs, even when no one has the wisdom to recognize it yet. Alex's assignment to the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force Communications Unit at Camp Pendleton felt like exile rather than opportunity. She had dreamed of leading Marines into battle, of making split-second decisions that would save lives and accomplish critical missions. Instead, she found herself hunched over radio equipment in a climate-controlled communications bunker, managing transmissions between combat units and command headquarters while the real action happened hundreds of miles away. The communications center operated around the clock, a sterile environment filled with banks of radio equipment, computer terminals, and status boards tracking Marine units deployed across multiple theaters of operation. Alex's official title was Field Radio Operator, but in practical terms, she was a highly educated switchboard operator, routing messages and maintaining communication links while others conducted the missions she had trained her entire life to. Lead Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had been running the communications center for 8 years, and he recognized the look of crushed dreams when Alex reported for duty on her first day. Torres was a compact man with graying temples and calloused hands, someone who had spent his early career in combat roles before a shoulder injury relegated him to support operations. He understood the bitter taste of having your military trajectory altered by circumstances beyond your control. "Rodriguez," Torres said as he showed Alex to her workstation, "I know this isn't what you signed up for. I read your file, our OTC honor graduate, perfect evaluation scores, leadership recommendations. That read like love letters. But let me tell you something about communications work. We're the nervous system of every operation. Without us, those combat units you wanted to lead are just isolated groups of Marines stumbling around in the dark." Alex nodded politely, but Torres could see the disappointment in her eyes. She was going through the motions, fulfilling her military obligation while mourning the career she would never have. Her initial weeks in the communications center were competent but uninspired. She handled radio traffic efficiently, maintained equipment properly, and followed protocols exactly as written. But there was no spark, no evidence of the exceptional leadership potential that had impressed her ROTC instructors. The communications center supported Marine units in Afghanistan, Iraq, and various peacekeeping operations around the world. Alex monitored radio chatter from patrols, convoy operations, and forward operating bases, listening to the voices of Marines who were living the life she had wanted for herself. She heard the tension in their communications during contact with enemy forces, the relief when missions were completed successfully, and the urgent desperation when things went wrong. During quiet overnight shifts, Alex found herself studying the communication patterns of different units, analyzing how information flowed between field commanders and their subordinates. She began to notice subtle variations in radio protocol that revealed important information about unit morale, leadership effectiveness, and operational stress levels. A patrol leader who spoke too quickly might be dealing with unusual pressure. A unit that used excessive formal language might be experiencing trust issues between officers and enlisted personnel. "You're hearing something the rest of us are missing," Torres observed one evening after Alex had successfully predicted which units would request medical evacuation, support based solely on changes in their communication patterns. Most radio operators focus on message content. You're listening to emotional context. Torres began paying closer attention to Alex's work, and what he saw impressed him. She had developed an intuitive understanding of the psychological state of units in the field, often detecting problems before field commanders themselves recognized them. When a patrol in Helmand Province began showing signs of combat stress in their radio transmissions, Alex quietly alerted medical personnel who were able to provide intervention before the situation deteriorated. When communication patterns suggested tensions between an officer and his subordinates, Alex found ways to route messages that reduced friction and improved unit cohesion. "Rodriguez," Torres said during one of their evening conversations, "you're doing something I've never seen in 20 years of military communications. You're reading between the lines, understanding not just what people are saying, but what they're feeling. That's not normal radio operator stuff. That's advanced psychological operations." Alex began to realize that her assignment to communications might not have been the career-ending punishment she had initially perceived. The skills that the evaluation board had dismissed as emotional weakness were actually providing her with unique insights into military operations. She could assess unit effectiveness, predict operational problems, and provide support that went far beyond simple message relay. Her daily routine evolved into something resembling the leadership role she had always wanted, just executed through different methods. Instead of directly commanding Marines in the field, she was supporting them through enhanced communication services. She began developing informal protocols for identifying units under stress, for routing critical information more efficiently, and for providing the kind of emotional support that could be delivered through professional radio communications. When Lieutenant Daniel Hayes checked in from a forward operating base in Afghanistan, Alex could hear the exhaustion and frustration in his voice, even though his words remained strictly professional. His unit had been conducting daily patrols for 3 weeks without significant rest, and the stress was evident in their radio communications. Instead of simply acknowledging his status reports, Alex began including subtle expressions of recognition and support in her responses. "Lima 7, this is base communications," Alex would respond. "Roger your patrol report. Be advised, weather conditions are favorable for your sector, and resupply is confirmed for 1,400 hours. Outstanding work maintaining operational tempo under challenging conditions." Her messages followed regulations perfectly, but they also conveyed respect, recognition, and awareness of what the field units were experiencing. Torres watched Alex's evolution with growing admiration. She was transforming a routine support role into something approaching psychological operations, using her emotional intelligence to provide the kind of morale support that could mean the difference between mission success and failure. Her radio transmissions became a source of stability and encouragement for Marines operating under extreme stress in hostile territory. "You know what you're doing here, Rodriguez?" Torres asked one evening as they reviewed communication logs. "You're proving that emotional intelligence isn't a weakness in military operations, it's a force multiplier. Those Marines in the field are performing better because you understand what they need to hear, not just what they need to know." But Alex's most significant contribution came during a routine night shift when she detected something in a transmission from Afghanistan that everyone else had missed. A patrol leader's voice contained subtle signs of stress that went beyond normal operational concerns. His unit was reporting normal status, but Alex's trained ear caught undertones that suggested something was seriously wrong. "Torres," Alex said quietly, "I think Lima 7 is in trouble. I know their status report says everything is normal, but something in Lieutenant Hayes' voice suggests they're dealing with a situation they can't talk about openly." Torres listened to the recorded transmission but couldn't detect anything unusual. "Rodriguez, you might be reading too much into routine communication. Hayes sounds fine to me." But Alex trusted her instincts. She had spent months learning to read the emotional subtext of military communications, and every indication suggested that Hayes' unit was facing a crisis they couldn't report through normal channels. The question was whether anyone would trust her assessment enough to act on it, or whether her insights would be dismissed as the over-emotional responses of someone deemed unfit for combat operations. That little did anyone know that Alex's ability to hear what others couldn't would soon become the key to preventing a disaster that would save 15 Marines from a situation that conventional military thinking could never have anticipated or resolved. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had been in the military long enough to recognize exceptional talent when he saw it, even when that talent didn't fit conventional expectations. As he watched Alex work during the weeks following her assignment to communications, he began to understand that the evaluation board had made a catastrophic error in judgment. They had assessed Alex's emotional intelligence as a liability when it was actually the kind of strategic asset that could revolutionize military operations. Torres had his own complicated history with military bureaucracy. 15 years earlier, he had been a promising infantry sergeant leading patrols in Iraq when an IED explosion shattered his left shoulder and ended his combat career. The transition to communications work had been devastating. He felt like he was watching the war from the sidelines instead of participating in it. But over the years, Torres had come to understand that effective communication was the foundation of every successful military operation, and that the right person in a communications role could have more impact than entire platoons of frontline soldiers. "Rodriguez," Torres said one evening as they finished their shift, "I want to show you something that's not in any official manual." He led Alex to a secure conference room adjacent to the communications center and pulled out a thick binder labeled Operational Psychology Assessment Protocols. The manual was filled with charts, graphs, and analytical frameworks that looked more like graduate-level psychology coursework than military doctrine. "This is unofficial curriculum I've been developing for 8 years, Torres explained. "Advanced techniques for reading psychological indicators in military communications. The Pentagon has been experimenting with this kind of analysis, but they haven't figured out how to implement it operationally. You, however, have been doing it instinctively. Since your first week here." Alex opened the manual and found herself looking at sophisticated frameworks for analyzing voice stress patterns, communication frequency variations, and linguistic indicators of unit morale. It was exactly what she had been doing intuitively, but systematized and refined into a comprehensive analytical approach. "Where did you learn all this?" "I started developing these techniques after my injury, when I realized that effective communication support required understanding the psychological state of field units," Torres replied. "I've been working with military psychologists and communication specialists to create assessment tools that could help us provide better support to deployed Marines. But I needed someone with your natural abilities to actually test these methods." Torres had been waiting years for someone like Alex, a communications operator with the emotional intelligence and analytical skills necessary to implement advanced psychological assessment techniques. Her arrival in his unit represented an opportunity to prove that communications personnel could provide support that went far beyond simple message relay. "Starting tomorrow, you're going to begin informal training in advanced operational psychology," Torres announced. "This isn't official military training, and it's not something you can put on your service record. But I believe these skills could save lives, and you're the first person I've met who has the natural ability to make them work." The training began the next evening after regular duty hours. Torres had converted a small storage room into an unofficial classroom, complete with audio equipment for analyzing recorded communications and reference materials covering everything from crisis psychology to cross-cultural communication techniques. Alex found herself studying voice stress analysis, learning to identify subtle indicators of fatigue, fear, confusion, and deception in radio transmissions. "Listen to this recording from a patrol in Helmand Province," Torres said, playing audio. "From a routine status report. Tell me what you hear beyond the actual words being spoken." Alex listened carefully, focusing not just on the content of the message but on the speaker's tone, pace, and inflection patterns. The patrol leader sounds confident in his status report, but there's tension in his voice when he mentions the local population, Alex observed. His words are saying that civilian interaction has been normal, but his vocal patterns suggest he's concerned about something he can't discuss openly. Torres nodded approvingly. "Exactly. And 3 days after this transmission, that patrol was ambushed by insurgents who had been gathering intelligence from seemingly friendly local civilians. The patrol leader suspected something was wrong, but he didn't have a secure way to communicate his concerns through standard radio protocols." The training sessions became the highlight of Alex's days. She was finally using her mind in ways that felt meaningful, developing skills that could have real impact on military operations. Torres taught her to recognize the subtle signs of combat stress, to identify when units were experiencing leadership problems, and to detect when standard operational reports were masking significant tactical concerns. More importantly, Torres was teaching Alex how to provide Psychological support through communications without violating radio protocols or operational security requirements. She learned to craft responses that provided emotional encouragement while maintaining professional standards, to ask questions that helped field commanders clarify their thinking, and to relay information in ways that boosted morale and confidence. The key is understanding that every radio transmission is both an exchange of information and a psychological interaction, Torres explained during one of their sessions. Marines in combat zones are isolated, stressed, and dealing with life or death decisions every day. The way we communicate with them can either add to their stress or help them manage it more effectively. Alex began implementing these techniques during her regular shifts, and the results were remarkable. Units that received communications from Alex reported higher morale, clearer decision-making, and better coordination with headquarters. She was providing a level of support that went far beyond anything specified in her job description. But the impact was undeniable. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes, whose unit had been conducting extended patrols in Afghanistan, began specifically requesting Alex as his communications contact. Rodriguez has this way of making you feel like headquarters actually understands what you're dealing with out here, Hayes told his fellow officers. When she's handling our communications, it feels like we have an advocate back at base, someone who gets the human side of what we're doing. Torres documented every success, every instance where Alex's enhanced communication techniques resulted in improved field operations. He was building a case file that he hoped would eventually convince military leadership to officially recognize and implement these psychological support protocols. But more immediately, he was preparing Alex for responsibilities that neither of them could have anticipated. Rodriguez, I want you to understand something, Torres said during one of their evening training sessions. The evaluation board that declared you unfit for combat was wrong about your emotional responses being a liability. But they were also wrong about something else. They assumed that combat effectiveness requires emotional detachment. What we're proving here is that emotional intelligence can be a tactical advantage, that understanding people better makes you a more effective military professional, not a less effective one. As Alex's skills continued to develop, Torres began giving her access to more sensitive communications transmissions from special operations units, diplomatic security teams, and other high-stakes assignments where psychological assessment could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. He was preparing her for the moment when her unique combination of technical expertise and emotional intelligence would be called upon to solve a problem that conventional military thinking couldn't address. Neither Torres nor Alex realized how soon that moment would arrive, or that it would involve 15 Marines trapped in enemy territory with no conventional rescue options available. But when that crisis emerged, Alex would be ready to demonstrate that the military's greatest assets are often the people who don't fit traditional expectations, and that emotional intelligence isn't a weakness to be suppressed, it's a strength to be leveraged for maximum tactical advantage. The breakthrough moment came during a seemingly routine night shift in November, when Alex intercepted a transmission that would validate everything Torres had been teaching her about psychological assessment in military communications. It was 230 hours, and most of the communication center was operating on skeleton crew when Lieutenant Hayes' voice crackled through the radio with what appeared to be a standard patrol status report. Base communications, this is Lima 7. Hayes transmitted with his usual professional composure. Conducting routine patrol, Sector 7 Alpha. All personnel accounted for, no enemy contact. Proceeding to Checkpoint Bravo as scheduled. Estimated arrival, 0400 hours. To every other communications operator in the center, this was exactly what it appeared to be, a routine update from a unit conducting standard patrol operations. The words were regulation perfect, the timing was appropriate, and Hayes' voice maintained the calm professionalism expected from a Marine officer. But Alex heard something else entirely, something that made her blood run cold. "Torres," Alex called quietly to her supervisor, who was reviewing duty rosters at his desk. "I need you to listen to this transmission. Something's wrong with Lima 7's situation." Torres approached Alex's workstation with skeptical curiosity. He had learned to trust Alex's instincts over the past few months, but this seemed like a routine communication that wouldn't warrant special attention. "What are you hearing that concerns you, Rodriguez?" Alex replayed the recorded transmission, pointing out vocal indicators that would have been impossible to detect without her specialized training. "Listen to the micro-pauses between words when he mentions no enemy contact. His breathing pattern changes slightly when he gives the estimated arrival time. And notice how he emphasizes all personnel accounted for. That's not standard phrasing for a routine patrol report." Torres listened to the transmission 3 more times, focusing on the subtle vocal cues that Alex had identified. Gradually, he began to hear what she was detecting: tiny variations in tone and timing that suggested Hayes was communicating under stress or constraint. "You think he's in a situation where he can't speak freely?" "I think Lima 7 is compromised," Alex replied grimly. "Hayes is trying to communicate that they're in trouble, but he can't speak openly about it. The formal language, the emphasis on all personnel accounted for, the slightly rushed delivery, these are all indicators that he's operating under surveillance or threat." This was exactly the kind of analysis that Torres had been training Alex to perform, but it was also the first time her assessment carried such serious operational implications. If Alex was right, a 15-man Marine patrol was in immediate danger in hostile territory. If she was wrong, they would be launching an unnecessary response based on psychological interpretation rather than concrete intelligence. "Rodriguez, I need you to be absolutely certain about this assessment," Torres said seriously. "If we alert command based on your psychological reading of this transmission, we're going to have to explain why we think a routine patrol report indicates an emergency situation." Alex reviewed her analysis one more time, applying every technique Torres had taught her about voice stress detection and psychological assessment. The indicators were subtle but consistent. Hayes was definitely communicating under some form of constraint or threat. His message contained coded information that only someone trained in psychological communication analysis would recognize. "Torres, I'm confident in my assessment," Alex stated firmly. "Lima 7 is in trouble, and Hayes is trying to tell us without being able to speak openly. We need to alert command immediately." Torres made the decision that would define both of their careers. He trusted Alex's analysis enough to wake up Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, at 0245 hours with a report that a patrol was potentially compromised based on psychological assessment of routine radio communications. It was the kind of call that could end careers if it proved to be wrong. "Colonel Morrison, this is Staff Sergeant Torres in communications," Torres began when the colonel answered his phone. "Sir, we have reason to believe that Lima 7 patrol is operating under hostile surveillance or constraint based on psychological analysis of their recent transmission." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough for Torres to wonder if he had just made a catastrophic career-ending mistake. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was known for his no-nonsense approach to military operations and his skepticism toward anything that seemed like psychological speculation rather than hard intelligence. "Torres, explain to me why you're waking me up at 0245 hours based on psychological interpretation of a routine patrol report," Morrison said with barely controlled irritation. "What specific intelligence indicates that Lima 7 is compromised?" Torres looked at Alex, who nodded encouragingly, then proceeded to explain the analysis that had led to their conclusion. He described the vocal stress indicators, the unusual phrasing patterns, and the subtle communication cues that suggested Hayes was operating under constraint. It sounded almost ridiculous when spoken aloud, the idea that tiny variations in voice tone, could indicate a military emergency. "Colonel, I know this sounds unconventional," Torres continued, "but we have a communications operator here who has been trained in advanced psychological assessment techniques. Her analysis has been consistently accurate in predicting operational problems based on communication patterns. I believe her assessment is reliable enough to warrant further investigation." Morrison was quiet for another long moment before responding. "Torres, I'm going to authorize a drone reconnaissance of Lima 7's position and attempt to establish alternative communication with their patrol. If your psychological assessment is wrong, we're going to have a serious conversation about appropriate use of military resources. If you're right, then we may owe your communications specialist a significant debt of gratitude." As Torres hung up the phone, Alex felt a mixture of confidence and terror. She had just convinced military command to authorize operational resources based entirely on her psychological interpretation of a radio transmission. If Hayes and his patrol were actually fine, she would have proven that her emotional intelligence was exactly the kind of liability the evaluation board had claimed it to be. But if she was right, if Lima 7 was really in trouble and needed help they couldn't directly request, then she would have demonstrated that emotional intelligence could be a tactical advantage that conventional military thinking had been foolish to ignore. Within 30 minutes, drone reconnaissance confirmed Alex's worst fears. Lima 7 was not conducting a routine patrol. They were surrounded by hostile forces in a valley with no apparent escape route, operating under conditions that made normal radio communication impossible. Hayes had been trying to communicate their desperate situation through coded language that only someone trained in psychological assessment could have recognized. "Rodriguez," Torres said as they watched the drone footage on a secure monitor, "you just saved 15 Marines who were about to disappear into enemy territory with no one realizing they were in trouble. Your psychological assessment detected a crisis that conventional intelligence completely missed. But the real test was just beginning. Now that they knew Lima 7 was trapped, they needed to figure out how to save them. And that rescue operation would require exactly the kind of unconventional thinking and emotional intelligence that the military had deemed too dangerous for combat operations. The Situation Room at Camp Pendleton buzzed with tense energy as intelligence officers, tactical planners, and senior commanders gathered around digital maps displaying Lima 7's precarious position. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stood at the VIWA head of the table, his face grim as he absorbed the full scope of the crisis that Alex's psychological assessment had uncovered. 15 Marines were trapped in a narrow valley in Helmand Province, surrounded by an estimated 40 Taliban fighters, who had been planning this ambush for weeks. "Gentlemen, ladies," Morrison began, addressing the assembled rescue planning team, "we have a worst-case scenario developing in Afghanistan." Lima 7 patrol walked into what appears to be a carefully orchestrated trap. They're pinned down in Dead Horse Valley with limited ammunition, no clear escape route, and enemy forces controlling all the high ground. The drone footage painted a devastating picture. Hayes and his 14 Marines had taken defensive positions behind a cluster of boulders in the valley floor, but they were completely surrounded by Taliban fighters positioned on the ridgelines above them. Any movement in any direction would expose them to concentrated fire from multiple angles. Conventional rescue operations, helicopter extraction, ground reinforcement, or airstrikes were impossible due to the terrain and the proximity of hostile forces to the trapped Marines. Major Patricia Collins, the base's senior tactical officer, outlined the challenges they faced. The valley is too narrow for helicopter operations, and the surrounding ridges are heavily fortified. Any ground rescue force would have to fight through the same terrain that trapped Lima 7 in the first place. Airstrikes aren't feasible because the enemy positions are too close to our personnel. How long can they hold their position? Morrison asked, studying the tactical display that showed enemy positions gradually tightening around the trapped Patrol. Captain Robert Davis, the intelligence officer, consulted his reports grimly. Based on their last ammunition count and the intensity of enemy fire, Lima 7 has maybe 6 hours before they're overrun. The Taliban fighters know they have them trapped. They're in no hurry. They can afford to wait and let our Marines exhaust their resources. Torres had been invited to the planning session because his communications unit was maintaining contact with the trapped patrol, but he felt increasingly frustrated as he listened to the tactical officers systematically eliminate every conventional rescue option. Colonel Morrison, Torres interrupted, there might be an unconventional approach worth considering. Morrison looked at Torres with skeptical attention. Staff Sergeant, we're dealing with a complex tactical situation that requires military expertise, not communication theory. Sir, respectfully, the person who detected this crisis in the first place might have insights that conventional tactical thinking is missing, Torres replied. Sergeant Rodriguez's psychological assessment capabilities identified this situation when our normal intelligence gathering completely missed it. Maybe her unconventional perspective could identify rescue options that we're not seeing. The suggestion that a communications operator, especially one who had been deemed unfit for combat, might contribute to tactical planning created an uncomfortable silence in the room. Major Collins looked particularly skeptical. Staff Sergeant Torres, psychological assessment is one thing, but tactical planning requires combat experience and strategic training that a radio operator simply doesn't possess. Morrison, however, was pragmatic enough to consider any option that might save 15 Marines. Bring Rodriguez to the situation room, he ordered. If she can see things we're missing, I want to hear what she has to say. Alex entered the situation room feeling like she was walking into a courtroom where she was about to be judged by the same kind of military establishment that had already declared her unfit for the responsibilities she was now being asked to assume. The assembled officers looked at her with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. She was a failed combat candidate being asked to solve a tactical problem that experienced officers couldn't resolve. Sergeant Rodriguez, Morrison began, you're here because your psychological assessment identified this crisis. I want you to look at this situation and tell me if you see rescue options that we're missing. But understand 15 Marines. Lives depend on getting this right. Alex studied the tactical displays, absorbing the terrain features, enemy positions, and resource constraints that had stumped the conventional planners. But instead of focusing solely on military assets and tactical maneuvers, she began thinking about the human elements of the situation, the psychological state of the trapped Marines, the motivations and expectations of the Taliban fighters, and the communication dynamics that might create opportunities for unconventional solutions. Colonel Morrison, Alex said carefully, I need to understand Lieutenant Hayes' psychological state and the morale of his unit. Have we been able to establish detailed communication with them since confirming their situation? Major Collins looked impatient. Rodriguez, we're dealing with tactical realities, not psychological theories. The Marines are trapped, the enemy has superior positioning, and we need a military solution, not a counseling session. But Alex persisted. Sir, with respect, psychological factors are tactical factors. If Lieutenant Hayes and his Marines are maintaining good morale and unit cohesion, they might be capable of actions that wouldn't be possible if they were demoralized or panicked. Understanding their mental state could reveal rescue options that depend on their ability to execute complex maneuvers under extreme stress. Torres supported Alex's approach. Colonel Rodriguez has been monitoring Lima 7's communications for months. She understands their unit dynamics, their communication patterns, and their psychological capabilities better than anyone else in this room. Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone present. Rodriguez, I'm giving you direct communication access to Lima 7. I want you to conduct a detailed psychological assessment of their current state and their capability to participate in their own rescue. If you can identify human factors that create tactical opportunities, I want to know about them. Alex approached the secure radio with 15 Marines' lives weighing on her shoulders. Everything she had learned about psychological assessment, crisis communication, and emotional intelligence was about to be tested under the most extreme circumstances possible. She needed to determine not just what Hayes and his unit were feeling, but how those feelings could be leveraged to create rescue opportunities that conventional tactical thinking couldn't envision. Lima 7, this is Base Communications, Rodriguez. Speaking, Alex transmitted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. Lieutenant Hayes, I need to conduct a detailed status assessment of your unit's capabilities and psychological readiness. This information will be used for tactical planning purposes. Hayes' response crackled through the radio with barely controlled tension. Rodriguez, we're pinned down with limited options and time running out. Whatever you're planning, it needs to happen fast. Alex was about to attempt something that had never been tried in military history, using psychological assessment and emotional intelligence to design a rescue operation that would save 15 Marines from a seemingly impossible situation. The same emotional skills that had been deemed too dangerous for combat were now the only hope for bringing Hayes and his unit home alive. Alex's hands remained steady on the radio controls as she began the most important psychological assessment of her career. In the situation room behind her, tactical officers watched skeptically as she attempted to extract information that could somehow transform an impossible rescue into a viable operation. 15 Marines were counting on her ability to understand human psychology under extreme stress and translate that understanding into tactical advantage. Lieutenant Hayes, Alex transmitted, I need you to give me detailed information about your unit's current psychological state. I know this seems unconventional, but I need to understand your Marines' emotional readiness and mental capabilities under current stress conditions. Hayes' response revealed the professionalism that Alex had come to admire during months of radio communications. Rodriguez, morale is holding steady despite our situation. My Marines are scared but focused. They trust their training and they trust each other. What kind of specific information do you need? Alex had spent countless hours learning to read psychological indicators in Hayes' voice, and what she heard now was exactly what she had hoped for: a unit that was stressed but not broken, frightened but not panicked. These Marines retained the mental flexibility and emotional cohesion necessary for complex operations under extreme pressure. Hayes, I need to know about individual psychological profiles, Alex continued. Which of your Marines handle stress through aggressive action? Which ones perform better when given specific technical tasks? Who are your natural leaders when you're not available to give direct orders? The question seemed bizarre to the tactical officers listening in the situation room, but Alex was building a psychological map of the trapped unit that would allow her to design a rescue operation based on human strengths rather than military assets alone. She needed to understand how each Marine would respond under pressure so she could create a plan that leveraged their individual psychological profiles. Hayes provided detailed assessments of his 14 Marines, describing personalities, stress responses, and individual capabilities with the precision that comes from months of combat operations together. Corporal Martinez responds to pressure by becoming hyper-focused and technically precise. Private Johnson gets calmer under stress and becomes our best decision-maker when I'm not available. Sergeant Williams has aggressive instincts but excellent tactical judgment. He can channel aggression into effective action. As Alex gathered this psychological intelligence, she began to see possibilities that conventional tactical planning had missed entirely. The Taliban fighters surrounding Lima 7 expected rational military responses: helicopter extraction, ground reinforcement, or coordinated airstrikes. They had positioned themselves to counter traditional rescue operations, But they weren't prepared for a psychological operation that would turn the trapped Marines' apparent weaknesses into tactical advantages. "Colonel Morrison," Alex announced, turning away from the radio, "I have a rescue proposal, but it requires trusting psychological assessment over conventional tactics." Morrison looked at her with intense skepticism. Rodriguez were dealing with 40 enemy fighters in fortified positions. What psychological approach could possibly overcome that kind of tactical disadvantage? Alex approached the tactical display and began outlining her unconventional plan. "Sir, the Taliban fighters have Lima 7 trapped, but they're also trapped by their own expectations. They're positioned to counter military rescue operations, not psychological ones. If we can make them believe that Lima 7 is behaving irrationally, we can create confusion that will allow Hayes and his Marines to escape." Major Collins interrupted with obvious frustration. "Rodriguez, this isn't a psychology experiment. We need military solutions, not theoretical speculation about enemy expectations." But Alex persisted, her confidence growing as she explained how psychological principles could create tactical opportunities. "Major Collins, hear me out. The Taliban fighters expect the trapped Marines to behave like rational soldiers conserving ammunition, maintaining defensive positions, waiting for rescue. But what if Lima 7 started behaving in ways that seemed irrational or desperate?" Alex outlined a plan that combined psychological manipulation with tactical deception. Hayes and his Marines would begin making radio transmissions that suggested panic, desperation, and poor decision-making. They would fire their weapons in patterns that seemed wasteful and uncoordinated. They would create the impression of a unit that was falling apart under pressure, becoming unpredictable and dangerous to themselves. "The Taliban fighters will start to question their own tactical assessments," Alex explained. "If the trapped Marines appear to be acting irrationally, the enemy will begin to worry about unexpected actions. They'll start to doubt their intelligence about American capabilities and training. Uncertainty will make them more cautious, more likely to make mistakes." But the real genius of Alex's plan was how it leveraged the psychological profile she had just assessed. Hayes' Marines aren't actually going to panic or act irrationally. They're going to perform coordinated deception based on their individual psychological strengths. Corporal Martinez will use his technical precision to create convincing fake radio malfunctions. Private Johnson will use his calm decision-making to coordinate seemingly chaotic movements. Sergeant Williams will channel his aggressive instincts into tactical misdirection. Torres watched Alex's presentation with growing admiration. She was applying everything he had taught her about psychological assessment, but she was also demonstrating innovative thinking that went far beyond anything in his unofficial training manual. "Colonel Morrison, Rodriguez's plan uses the enemy's psychological expectations against them. It's a form of tactical deception that could work precisely because it's so unconventional." Morrison studied the proposed operation with the skepticism of someone who had spent 20 years relying on conventional military doctrine. But he was also practical enough to recognize that conventional approaches had already failed. "Rodriguez, explain to me exactly how psychological deception translates into actual tactical advantage. How does making the enemy think our Marines are panicking actually help them escape?" Alex had anticipated this question and was ready with a detailed explanation of how psychological pressure could create tactical opportunities. "Colonel, when the Taliban fighters start to doubt their intelligence and worry about unpredictable American behavior, they'll begin to second-guess their own positioning and coordination. Some will want to move closer to observe the Marines' irrational behavior. Others will want to pull back to avoid unexpected actions. This psychological uncertainty will create gaps in their coverage and coordination," Alex continued. "Hayes and his Marines can exploit these gaps, but only if they understand the psychological dynamics at work and can time their actual escape movement to coincide with maximum enemy confusion. The plan was audacious, unconventional, and completely dependent on psychological principles that most military officers had never considered as tactical tools. It required Hayes and his Marines to perform coordinated deception under extreme stress, while simultaneously preparing for a complex escape maneuver that would have to be executed with perfect timing. Morrison looked around the situation room at his tactical officers, all of whom appeared deeply skeptical of Alex's psychological approach to military rescue operations. But 15 Marines were running out of time, and conventional wisdom had already proven inadequate to the challenge they faced. "Rodriguez," Morrison said finally, "you have one chance to prove that emotional intelligence can solve tactical problems that military expertise can't handle. If this works, you'll have revolutionized how we think about rescue operations. If it fails, 15 Marines will pay the price for trusting psychology over tactics." At 0347 hours, Alex began implementing the most unconventional rescue operation in military history. Her voice remained steady as she transmitted detailed psychological instructions to Lieutenant Hayes, explaining how his Marines would use coordinated deception to manipulate enemy expectations and create their own escape opportunity. The Situation Room watched in tense silence as Alex transformed emotional intelligence into tactical advantage. "Hayes, you and your Marines are going to perform a psychological operation that will make the Taliban fighters question everything. They think they know about American military behavior," Alex transmitted. "This requires perfect coordination and complete trust in psychological principles that most military doctrine ignores." Hayes' response revealed both skepticism and desperation. "Rodriguez, we're willing to try anything at this point, but I need to understand exactly what you're asking my Marines to do. We can't afford mistakes when we're surrounded by 40 hostiles with superior positioning." Alex began explaining the deception protocol with the same precision Torres had taught her to apply to psychological assessment. "Hayes, your Marines are going to simulate a unit breakdown while actually maintaining perfect coordination. Corporal Martinez will create fake radio malfunctions that suggest equipment failure and communication breakdown. Private Johnson will coordinate seemingly chaotic movements that actually establish optimal positioning for escape. Sergeant Williams will direct aggressive but seemingly uncoordinated fire that creates tactical misdirection." The plan required Hayes' Marines to perform academy-level acting while under extreme combat stress, convincing sophisticated enemy observers that a well-trained unit was falling apart when they were actually executing a complex coordinated operation. Each Marine had to understand both their individual role in the deception and their part in the actual escape sequence that would follow. "Rodriguez, explain to me how simulating panic creates actual tactical advantage," Hayes requested, his voice carrying the weight of 15 lives depending on her answer. Alex had rehearsed this explanation during her months of training with Torres, but delivering it to Marines under fire in hostile territory felt completely different from practicing in a secure classroom environment. "Hayes, the Taliban fighters expect rational military behavior from trapped Americans. They've positioned themselves to counter logical escape attempts. But if your unit appears to be making irrational decisions, the enemy will start to doubt their intelligence and question their tactical assumptions. When people become uncertain about what to expect, they make mistakes," Alex continued. "Some Taliban fighters will want to move closer to observe your breakdown. Others will want to pull back to avoid unpredictable American actions. This psychological uncertainty will create gaps in their coverage that didn't exist when they thought they understood your capabilities." Hayes absorbed Alex's explanation while incoming fire echoed in the background of his transmission. "Rodriguez, I understand the theory, but I need specific timing. When do we transition from psychological deception to actual escape movement?" This was the most critical aspect of Alex's plan, timing the shift from psychological manipulation to tactical execution with precision that would determine whether 15 Marines lived or died. Hayes, I'll be monitoring Taliban radio communications to assess their psychological state. When I detect maximum confusion and uncertainty in their coordination, I'll give you the signal to begin actual escape movement. Alex had been studying intercepted Taliban communications for months, learning to recognize psychological indicators in Pashto and Dari, the same way she had learned to assess American military transmissions. She could detect stress, uncertainty, and confusion in enemy communications just as effectively as she could analyze the emotional state of Hayes Marines. Begin psychological deception protocol now, Alex ordered. And Hayes Marines started the most sophisticated psychological operation ever attempted by a trapped military unit. Corporal Martinez began transmitting garbled radio communications that suggested equipment failure and panic. Base, this is Lima 7, we're static interference. Equipment malfunction. Can't maintain, transmission breaking up. His technical precision made the fake radio problems completely convincing while actually maintaining clear communication with Alex through coded phrases embedded in the apparent malfunction. Private Johnson started coordinating movements that appeared chaotic but actually positioned the Marines for optimal escape routes. His calm decision-making under pressure allowed him to direct seemingly frantic repositioning that confused Taliban observers while establishing tactical advantages for the actual breakout. Sergeant Williams began firing in patterns that seemed wasteful and uncoordinated, but actually provided suppressive fire that would support the escape movement. His aggressive instincts, channeled through Alex's psychological framework, created the impression of desperation while maintaining tactical effectiveness. The deception was working. Alex monitored Taliban communications as enemy fighters began expressing confusion and uncertainty about American behavior. The Americans are acting strangely, one Taliban commander reported. They appear to be making mistakes, but we should be cautious about unexpected actions. Some of their movements seem irrational, another Taliban fighter observed. Should we adjust our positions to better observe their behavior? Alex watched as psychological uncertainty began creating exactly the tactical opportunities her plan had predicted. Taliban fighters were questioning their intelligence, doubting their assumptions, and making small positioning adjustments that created gaps in their coverage of escape routes. Hayes, Alex transmitted when she detected maximum confusion in enemy communications. Taliban psychological assessment indicates optimal conditions for escape movement. Execute breakout sequence now. What happened next was a masterpiece of coordination that combined Hayes' combat leadership with Alex's psychological manipulation. The Marines transitioned seamlessly from simulated chaos to actual tactical movement, using the confusion they had created to execute an escape that conventional military thinking had deemed impossible. Hayes led his Marines through the gaps in Taliban coverage that psychological uncertainty had created, moving with precision and speed that surprised enemy fighters who had expected continued irrational behavior. The Taliban response was delayed and uncoordinated because they were still trying to understand whether American actions were tactical or desperate. Base communications, this is Hayes, came the transmission that Alex had been praying to hear. Lima 7 is clear of immediate danger and moving to extraction point. All 15 Marines accounted for, no casualties. Rodriguez, your psychological operation saved our lives. The Situation Room erupted in stunned silence as tactical officers processed what they had just witnessed. A communications operator deemed too emotional for combat had saved 15 Marines using psychological principles that challenged everything conventional military doctrine taught about rescue operations. Colonel Morrison looked at Alex with an expression that combined amazement, respect, and the dawning realization that the military establishment had completely misunderstood the tactical value of emotional intelligence. Rodriguez, you just proved that psychological assessment and emotional understanding can solve tactical problems that military expertise alone cannot address. Torres watched Alex's triumph with pride that went beyond professional satisfaction. His student had demonstrated that emotional intelligence wasn't a weakness to be suppressed in military operations. It was a strategic asset that could mean the difference between mission failure and extraordinary success, but Alex's greatest satisfaction came from Hayes' final transmission. Rodriguez, tell the evaluation board that declared you too emotional for combat that emotional intelligence just saved 15 Marines from certain death. Maybe it's time for the military to reconsider what makes someone fit for service. The debriefing session that followed the Lima 7 rescue became a turning point not just for Alex's career, but for how the entire military establishment understood the relationship between emotional intelligence and combat effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison convened an emergency review board that included the same officers who had originally deemed Alex unfit for combat service, along with senior Pentagon officials who had flown in specifically to understand how a psychological operation had succeeded where conventional tactics had failed. Captain Sarah Mitchell sat at the same conference table where she had delivered Alex's devastating rejection 8 months earlier, but now she was reviewing documentation of the most innovative rescue operation in recent military history. The woman she had dismissed as too emotional for combat had just saved 15 Marines, using precisely the psychological skills that the evaluation board had identified as disqualifying weaknesses. Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Morrison began. Your rescue operation for Lima 7 represents a fundamental challenge to how we assess military personnel and design tactical operations. This board needs to understand exactly how psychological principles translated into tactical advantage in hostile territory. Alex stood before the assembled officers with confidence that had been forged through months of proving that emotional intelligence could be a military asset rather than a liability. Colonel Morrison, the rescue succeeded because we understood the human elements of the tactical situation. The Taliban fighters had superior positioning and firepower, but they also had psychological expectations that could be manipulated through coordinated deception. Dr. Helen Foster, the psychological assessment specialist who had originally diagnosed Alex with hyperempathic response patterns, leaned forward with obvious curiosity. Sergeant Rodriguez, explain how your emotional investment in Lieutenant Hayes' unit, which we previously identified as a liability, contributed to mission success. Alex had prepared for this question during the months of unofficial training with Torres, but answering it in front of the people who had nearly ended her military career still felt surreal. Dr. Foster, my emotional connection to Hayes and his Marines wasn't a distraction from tactical thinking. It was essential to tactical thinking. I understood their individual psychological profiles, their stress responses, and their capabilities under pressure because I had invested emotionally in their well-being. That emotional investment allowed me to design a rescue operation that leveraged their human strengths rather than just their military training, Alex continued. Corporal Martinez could perform technical deception because I understood his personality. Private Johnson could coordinate complex movements because I knew how he responded to stress. Sergeant Williams could channel aggression effectively because I recognized his psychological patterns. Torres had been invited to present his analysis of Alex's performance, and his presentation challenged fundamental assumptions about military leadership and psychological fitness. This board originally rejected Sergeant Rodriguez because her emotional responses seemed incompatible with combat requirements, Torres explained. But her rescue of Lima 7 proves that emotional intelligence can be a tactical multiplier that enhances rather than compromises military effectiveness. Furthermore, Torres continued, Rodriguez's psychological assessment capabilities detected the Lima 7 crisis when conventional intelligence gathering completely missed it. Her emotional skills provided early warning that saved 15 Marines from a situation that would have been catastrophic if discovered through traditional methods. Major Patricia Collins, who had been skeptical of Alex's unconventional approach during the crisis, was forced to acknowledge the undeniable success of psychological tactics. Sergeant Rodriguez, your rescue operation succeeded, but it required resources and coordination that might not be available in other emergency situations. How do we systematically implement psychological approaches to tactical problems? Alex had spent considerable time thinking about this question, recognizing that her individual success needed to translate into broader changes in military doctrine. Major Collins, emotional intelligence and psychological assessment should be integrated into standard military training, not treated as specialized skills for unusual situations. Every leader should understand how to read psychological indicators, how to manage unit morale under stress, and how to leverage individual psychological strengths for tactical advantage. The review board spent 3 hours analyzing every aspect of the Lima 7 rescue, examining how psychological principles had created tactical opportunities that conventional military thinking had missed. They reviewed Alex's training records, her performance evaluations, and the documentation Torres had compiled of her innovative communication techniques. Captain Mitchell, who had delivered Alex's original rejection, was forced to confront the implications of the board's previous assessment. Sergeant Rodriguez, this board concluded that your emotional responses made you unsuitable for combat operations. Your rescue of Lima 7 suggests that our evaluation criteria may have been fundamentally flawed. Captain Mitchell, Alex replied. Carefully, I believe the evaluation board was correct that I don't fit traditional models of combat leadership. But maybe traditional models need to evolve to include different types of strength and different approaches to tactical thinking. The moment that defined Alex's vindication came when Colonel Robert Sterling, who had initially supported her rejection, stood to deliver the board's revised assessment. Sergeant Rodriguez, this review board finds that your psychological capabilities represent exactly the kind of innovative thinking that modern military operations require. Your emotional intelligence is not a liability to be managed, it's a strategic asset to be leveraged. Furthermore, Sterling continued, your rescue of Lima 7 demonstrates that our traditional evaluation criteria may be excluding personnel whose unconventional capabilities could provide significant tactical advantages. This board recommends immediate revision of psychological assessment protocols and the development of new career paths that recognize emotional intelligence as a military skill. Dr. Foster approached Alex after the formal session concluded, carrying a folder that contained the original psychological assessment that had nearly ended Alex's military career. Sergeant Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. My evaluation identified your emotional responses as pathological when they were actually exceptional. You've taught me that psychological assessment should focus on capabilities rather than conformity to traditional expectations. But the most meaningful recognition came from Lieutenant Hayes, who had flown back from Afghanistan specifically to thank Alex in person. Rodriguez, Hayes said, shaking her hand firmly, you saved 15 Marines. By being exactly who you are. Don't let anyone ever convince you that caring deeply about people is a weakness. In my experience, it's the strongest foundation for effective leadership. The review board's final decision transformed Alex's career trajectory and established new precedents for how the military assessed and utilized personnel with exceptional emotional intelligence. She was promoted to staff sergeant and assigned to develop training protocols that would integrate psychological assessment into standard military operations. More importantly, Alex's success led to the creation of the Military Psychological Operations Specialist Career Field, recognizing emotional intelligence and psychological assessment as distinct military skills worthy of specialized training and career development. The Rodriguez Protocol, named in her honor, became the standard framework for identifying and developing personnel whose unconventional capabilities could provide tactical advantages. Alex had proven that the military's most valuable assets might be the people who don't fit traditional molds, and that emotional intelligence isn't a weakness to be suppressed, it's a strength to be cultivated and strategically deployed. Her journey from rejected candidate to decorated specialist demonstrated that sometimes the traits that make you different are exactly what the world needs most, even when conventional wisdom lacks the vision to recognize them. Asterisk up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from U.S.